They said she earned her place in history on a night of ice and wire and stars, when other ships hesitated and the Carpathia did not. In April 1912, her captain, Arthur Rostron, ordered steam cut from the hotel services and fed to the engines, swung blankets and coffee and boats into readiness, and drove his Cunarder through black seas to the Titanic's last position. Survivors climbed her gangways shivering and stunned. A baby slept in a baker's coat. Sailors hauled, stewards carried, and the Carpathia's dining rooms turned into wards where grief learned to sit upright. For months afterward, she sailed with a kind of borrowed solemnity, a ship that had been present when the world learned how large the ocean could be. 6 years passed, and the ocean learned new manners. War turned sea lanes into chessboards, where the pieces moved under the surface and rules were written after the fact. The Carpathia put on gray paint and zigzagged. Her saloons stayed, but their chandeliers went dark more often. Her promenades saw more cold air than conversation. She hauled troops and cargo now. War made freight of everything, and listened for the distant rip of a periscope's wake. Signal lamps blinked in careful sentences. Wireless sets wore the gravity of churches. Every watch had a man whose whole job was to stare at water and imagine danger where the surface insisted there was none. On a July morning in 1918, the Atlantic carried its usual lie of calm. The war was lurching toward an end humans could feel in their bones, but could not schedule on a calendar. The Carpathia, westbound from Liverpool for Boston with a mixed cargo and a skeleton list of passengers allowed by wartime rules, slid down the familiar corridor south of Ireland. The light was the color of pewter, the sea, obedient for once, the ship, settled into a rhythm that made men trust their muscle memory. Somewhere beyond the curve of the horizon stood Fastnet's lighthouse, sharpening into day for ships it would not see. Zigzags are a ritual more than a plan. They convince crews they are not offering the ocean an easy arithmetic. The Carpathia angled and re-angled, her wake drawing broken chevrons. Lookouts kept their eyes on that odd seam where sky stitches to sea. In the wireless room, the operator sorted message priorities with the care of a man stacking porcelain. The captain reviewed orders for lifeboat crews, a habit by then as common as checking the weather. He had inherited a ship with a famous conscience. He meant to keep her cautious as well. The first torpedo announced itself the way they all did, with a white line that discovered the hull before anyone could shout a full sentence. It struck forward on the port side with a shock that stiffened the ship from stem to stern. Plates rang. Steam hissed. A cloud of dust rose from places that had not seen air in years. The Carpathia lurched and then remembered herself, settling to a new angle as doors banged and voices pitched upward. The second torpedo found her as the crew executed their drill, tearing at compartments already unsettled. The third blow felt meaner, as if the sea had decided that precision was a pleasure it would allow itself today. Captain William Prothero, Rostron was long gone to a White Star bridge and a peacetime kind of fame, gave the orders a man gives when everything around him is already in motion. Boats to the falls, passengers mustered, wireless, SOS, position, struck by torpedoes, taking on water. Bulkheads held without promising how long they would be stalwart. The engineers bled steam. Too much and the pumps die, too little, and the engines become anchors, and tried to stabilize a ship whose insides had become an argument. Above, the sea had its own debates. Men lowering boats into a swell that seemed invented for the purpose of fouling a line shouted over wind and habit. The oars bit, slid, bit again. Ropes snubbed and paid out. Canvas caps for the lifeboat plugs were passed down with the gravity of relics. Some passengers stared at the water as if it were a trick about to be explained. Others were already working the little math of survival. Keep the child's face up. Don't look down. Hold the rail until you count 3 voices saying the same thing. The submarine that had found them, a hunter whose number would be remembered in logbooks and courtrooms, watched from a periscope's cautious circle. It had stalked from a favorable angle and fired in tidy succession. A professional doing a professional's work in a war that made such sentences cruel to utter. Below decks, the sea took notes. Compartments that had never met one another shook hands through gaps that did not exist an hour earlier. The Carpathia's bows drew lower lines against the horizon. There is a quiet that follows shock, even on a sinking ship. Men who had trained their hands to work without asking permission found those hands suddenly precise beyond their natural gift. Knots behaved. Oars remembered water the way a key remembers a lock. The radio sent and sent again, throwing a net of distress into air thick with wartime noise. Somewhere in that noise, an armed trawler and a Flower-class sloop turned their bows toward a position and put faith in engines that would earn their pay before noon. It is an odd thing that a ship famous for a rescue should require one and find it delivered without fanfare. But the ocean keeps its ledgers balanced in ways human beings only rarely understand. When the rescuers arrived, the Carpathia was down by the head and listing like a woman too weary to keep up appearances. Boats hovered near, fat with people who watched without quite believing that a hull made of steel could look so mortal. Lines flew. The first survivors went up and over like bundles too precious to trust to a second throw. The sea insisted on its right to slap and interfere, but hands were stubborn and hearts, unusually, agreed on a plan. There were losses. In every account, they differ by a digit or a name, because the ocean demands a rounding error and the human mind obliges. A few died at the moment of impact below, where steam and metal do their worst work. A few went still in boats, their bodies deciding that shock and cold and history had offered all the news they could receive. Most lived, hauled to decks that would never have expected to carry the Carpathia's people, and handed blankets by sailors, who only later, over a mug, admitted they knew whose ship they had saved. When she went with a reluctance that felt like dignity. The bows paused, dipped, and then the stern rose with that awful show of hull that only a ship in extremis displays. The screws, momentarily clear, turned once as if by habit, and then hung still. Water ran green and white along steel plates that had seen the Hudson and the Tyrrhenian and the long gray mid-Atlantic. The name on the stern half vanished under foam and then reappeared in a last slow roll, like a signature being underlined by a hand that had changed its mind. Finally, the sea folded over the place where 1,000 dinners, 1,000 sunrises on deck, and one night of history had lived. Bubbles marked the grave. The surface resumed its innocent arithmetic. War is busy and cannot afford elegies in the moment. The rescuing ships turned for port with decks cluttered by people who had believed the ocean had finished noticing them in 1912. Telegraphed lists began, saved, missing, presumed. The Admiralty wrote a crisp summary. Newspapers added a paragraph that could not help invoking Titanic. The Carpathia's fame did not grant her a band on the way down, only a column inch above a dispatch from Flanders. In Boston and Liverpool, a few men who knew the engines by their true names stood in doorways and said nothing for a long time. The sea holds wrecks the way a library holds books, close, quiet, and without comment on which titles are read most often. For decades, the Carpathia lay in the cold, her rivets home to small, patient creatures, her passageways lit only by the weak green of an alien daylight. Divers would find her long after the war, and the photographs would show ribs and rails and the stillness that follows purpose. People would look and say, with the tidy wisdom of hindsight, that something about it felt just. But ships are more than steel. They are their rooms and the memories that walked in them. On Carpathia's promenade, women had leaned into wind after April 1912 and told each other how it felt to be among the living when the numbers might have gone the other way. In her dining room, a child had spilled tea, and a steward had laughed in a way that said he was making a decision to be kind. In her engine room, men had signed on to a different kind of courage, heat and noise, and the unshowy art of making motion. All of that traveled with her into the war and down through the white churn of sinking. History likes a moral. The ocean refuses one. Yet if there is a shape to this story, it is an arc that begins with a ship turning toward trouble for strangers and ends with strangers turning toward trouble for that ship. The ledger closed in the black of 1918, not because the sea had forgotten April 1912, but because in war, even good names are carried under. The Carpathia earned her epitaph years before she needed it. To go when called, to hold steady under grief, to keep faith with what floats. When she sank, she did it in silence, but by then, her voice had already crossed the water and lodged where such voices last, in the stubborn expectation that someone will answer when you send for help. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.